Hi, and welcome to Storytime. Well, here we are to Storytime, and I've really been kind of avoiding the preparation for this particular topic because I'm looking at fear and anger. Not my favorite emotions. And I was really validated and affirmed in reading Brené Brown's work, Atlas of the Heart. She talks about these emotions being high energy emotions. They're strong emotions. But she also says that it's important that we don't ignore, that we don't try and pretend that these emotions aren't part of our human experience. And likewise, they are not bad. Experiencing the emotions of fear and anger and other such high intensity emotions have such an important role to play. And yet, I can distinctly remember trying to deny those emotions in my visceral experience in my body. So I wrote a list of all the things that I could think of I gave myself 3 minutes, all the things I could think of in 3 minutes that I have been afraid of. I thought, I can do anything for 3 minutes, right? I mean, this is scary in and of itself, to focus all of my attention on that scares me. So here's what I've come up with. Death. I'm afraid of death. Now, less so today than I was when I was a kid. And I can remember just really a tangible experience of the priest in the Catholic faith was talking about the end of times and death as a final. And I just started heaving and sobbing and shaking. I was so afraid. Then another bout with fear of death was when I, as a young parent, my infant child was turning blue and having a seizure. And that tickled that same level of panic because I didn't know what to do, but a higher level of my fear that I didn't know from before, because now it was someone I loved. It was somebody else who was in this threat of dying. And kind of taking that trajectory in the next step, in the last couple of years, I have been really consumed, had to practice setting aside my fear of contributing to the spread of COVID. I wasn't so much afraid of my own catching of COVID, or even there was hints of what if I get it and what if I die in the early stages. Remember when that was the fear? It was more about how devastated I would feel, how counter to my mission it would be to contribute to the spread of COVID to my students, to my family, to my population. So in addition to death, another strong one for me is horror and Halloween. Ironically enough, with Halloween just being this weekend, my birthday being close to Halloween, there was often this overlap and this confusion for me as a child, the themes between my birthday, wanting to celebrate, and yet everything seemingly Halloween. And to this day, I have a tolerance of Halloween, definitely not a love. And I think it might be because of those overlaps between I wanted to celebrate my birthday and everyone else was ready to celebrate Halloween. I was middle child, so I wanted my attention when I wanted it, perhaps. But it was also because Halloween tapped into all of those fears, right? The fear of being harmed, the fear of death, the fear of even monsters and evil. But in my growing up, there was also an undertone of nuclear war. And truly, any kind of war just petrified me to my core. So why would I then in middle school take up reading Stephen King novels? Well, it brings me to my next fear, which was being alone, being like I don't fit in, like I don't belong, or more significantly, being left behind. And my best friend in middle school was reading the Stephen King novels, so I wanted to be included. So I read the Stephen King novels to the point where I couldn't sleep at night. And fortunately or not, my commitment to getting it right, or more importantly, avoiding doing it wrong, eventually gave me permission to not read the scary books and focus on getting the sleep so that I could perform well at school. So not all bad in that sense, and yet failure of a test or a class, disappointing an authority, a parent, a teacher, and fundamentally any kind of attention that was either unsolicited or, in my opinion, risky of failing became my nemesis. So Halloween, death, getting it wrong, all of this led into a way in which I learned to be. First, it showed up as wanting to be perfect and get it right all the time, if I could control everything. And that controlling evolved into a defensive, aggressive strategy one might call bossiness. That bossiness protected me from the vulnerability, but it also prohibited me from authenticity, from really belonging and feeling like there was that connection. So eventually, with a lot of deep personal work and gentle guidance from some key mentors in my life, that need to control and that fear of not fitting in and not belonging, it makes sense now in hindsight how the invitation has become such a key ingredient in how I live my life. Because belonging, as Brene Brown shares, is not only our root need, it is what defines us, what gives us a sense of value and purpose in living. And so not only do I now actively practice the invitation to others as a way in which I have influence over not being alone, not being abandoned, not being forgotten, because I'm the one inviting. Now, that's not to say that everyone always accepts my invitation or that I'm not without that feeling. That feeling still ebbs and flows, but by putting it into a framework on which I could learn a skill and then with disciplined practice hone that skill, I not only have become competent at inviting, my whole dharma, my whole life's work is about holding space and extending that invitation without expectation. This is to me what yoga living means in an embodied physical way. But I would be less than honest if I said that that wasn't also fueled by my own fears. My own fears that I'm not going to be able to contribute enough. I'm not going to be important enough. I'm not going to know enough. I'm not going to do enough. Hence, there's certificates and diplomas everywhere. There's tons and tons of academic accomplishments that were the tangible evidence of me trying to be enough. But that's not what it's about, right? It's not about how many things I can accomplish. Perhaps it's mostly about how many people can I connect with deeply, intimately, powerfully to inspire them to show up. And what I know is within my skill set now is that I can make space for them. There's two stories that come to mind that I kind of want to paint this picture a little bigger. And chronologically, the monster under the bed came first, in which case I didn't learn about the monster under my bed until I was much, much older. I mean, I knew there was a monster under my bed. I just didn't know it was my brother until I was 23 years old. And no one else believed that the monster under my bed was real. to the point where I would leap across the room, coming over the threshold of the door, and leap into my bed so as not to be grabbed from underneath the bed. And as soon as I would get into bed, or he'd shake the bed underneath me, I'd go and get my mom or my dad. Mom, Dad, there's a monster under my bed, I'm scared, blah, 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 right? He would move to the closet or behind the chair or somewhere else in the room so as to continue to scare me. Now, I don't think this would have been as powerful, except that the room that this was happening in was in our house in Maine, and it was a split level. So my windows were right at ground level. And the first night that we stayed in the house, it was before our furniture had even arrived from our move. We moved from Texas to Maine. Who does that? Anyway, the Murphys, that's my maiden name. The Murphys do that. And we arrived there before our belongings. And so I was sleeping on the floor, like on a sleeping bag, and looking up at the ground level. And there was a wolf outside my door. Now, outside my window. Now, it probably wasn't a wolf, but we lived in this lot that was surrounded by very, very dense New England woods. And so my imagination was absolutely filling in. I'm sure it was probably someone's German Shepherd, some neighbor dog, but I hadn't met any of the neighbors. I hadn't met any of the neighbor pets. And so when my brother started hiding under my bed, I had this very tangible experience that there were wolves in the forest. So what would it take for some other kind of creature to get into my room to do me harm? Now, again, I didn't learn about all of this until I was much older, and my brother confessed it in front of my peers. But it sat with me because fear often propelled me to learn new skills. So I'm going to fast forward now into middle school. And at this point, I've attended 5 different schools and had to start completely from scratch with relocating and moving. So does that make sense? Why I might have a fear of belonging, a fear of not fitting in, if I have to always practice and learn how to find my niche in? Well, I was very good at contorting myself to fit in, but I never actually had that sense of truly belonging in any of these places, for lots of who knows reasons why. But the fear of being left behind, the fear of doing it wrong, the fear of not being enough propelled me when I identified that one of the most tangible ways that fear showed up was the fear of speaking in public. Speaking when I was called on to read in my classes, speaking up for what I saw as perhaps an infraction of the rules. This might be where the bossiness was born, but I committed myself to learn how to speak in public, to do public speaking. So much so that I actually joined the speech team, the debate team, became captain of these teams when I was in high school, and eventually here we are, right? I do public speaking every single day, and it no longer terrifies me. And yet there's still that glimmer of what if I fuck up today, right? Still, if I misspeak or if I'm just flat out wrong. And so by being in these intentional moments to expose myself, to be vulnerable, to take a risk, I'm also getting more and more comfortable with the way that my body prepares for fear. I taught last week in the sense that sometimes it's helpful if we kind of hijack our mental brain to say, I'm excited, rather than, God, I'm so freaking scared, right? Yeah, the two can exist at the same time when we tap into our emotional level. The problem is I was getting stuck in my brain, which can only do one thing at a time. And that one thing was often protect, defend, defend. So by learning the skills of public speaking, not only did I put myself in a controlled environment where I could learn to do something hard, I actually cultivated the skills of speaking, but more importantly, the skills of being in that space of doing something that was hard for me, that was uncomfortable for me, that was inherently risky. So if you ask my husband and my children, they will tell you that I am a big risk taker, that I like to do scary things. Well, that's not entirely true, but I am a conscientious chooser of what risks I take. Because now that I can connect with how my body experiences this stress, this test, this kind of opportunity to discern the difference between I'm excited and I'm petrified, I can be in a lot more uncomfortable places long enough to recognize where I'm at and even to explore the ways out if need be. One of the most difficult feedback I ever received was from someone whom I love and adore. And they said to me, essentially, I wasn't very street smart. And they were comparing me to my sister, who they decided was very street smart. Now, my sister has broken more laws, more rules, more boundaries than I could even probably count myself. So whereas I went the road of perfection, she probably could be said to have gone the road of more rebellion. But I was really hurt by this evaluation, not because this person doesn't value academic smarts. And that's where this judgment came, is that I was book smart, my sister was street smart. But this person failed to recognize that just because I avoided those kinds of risky places didn't mean I wasn't street smart. It just meant I was intervening earlier so that I wasn't getting into pickles like my sister was. She could get herself out, sure, but I just avoided them from the get-go. And it wasn't until a good number of years later that I understood why that was so hurtful to me. It wasn't that it was meant to be hurtful from the person who said it, but I was received as hurtful because I spent a lot of time avoiding things I couldn't control and things that I could project as being harm-causing, risky to the point of undoing what I was trying to accomplish. So, yeah, I take risks. Yeah, I can even be in a room where there is a horror movie playing, but I don't watch it. But I no longer feel like I have to watch it to prove that I'm brave. I just have to show up in my life, because life itself is hard, is scary. If you show up authentically, if you're willing to make yourself vulnerable, to be seen, to be heard, to be imperfect. With that, I just want to give us, again, permission to be with these feelings. It doesn't mean that it gives us free will to act on these feelings and cause harm in the world. Quite the contrary. Our yoga practice, the mindfulness practice of paying attention to what we're feeling, compels us to process our emotions without doing harm. Hence, ahimsa, non-harming, is the first principle. So that might mean we need to talk through whatever it is that's happening. It might mean that we need to call upon our circle of support to help us redirect that energy. For me, breath work is always the first place I begin to get clearer. And then, as Brené Brown teaches, we often have to reach out, particularly if our story compels us or pushes us into perhaps shame, a feeling like I'm not worthy of doing it differently, I'm not capable of doing it differently, that we reach out to friends. We reach out to those we can trust, that we can lean on. And they help hold us up until we can stand on our own, until we can shift and learn the thing that might just help us avoid that position of fear or being harmed or being taken advantage of. So I don't know what your work is, but my work is continue to invite, because that's the only way that I know how to continue to, one, show up, and two, cultivate what I always wanted, was a space that I could just be me. Thanks for checking in for story time. Join me all month long in our meditations on Friday and our breathing practices on Wednesdays. Maybe even check in a coach's chat as we explore the emotions deeper of fear and anger all month long. Thanks so much for being here. Be well. Namaste. Any comments, questions, or observations?
I had a similar experience around avoiding trouble and being deemed to not be street smart for it. Even today, I feel like I get a lot of pushback of things that I'm just not willing to do because it seems so risky and unnecessary when I know potential consequences and that it would undo what I'm working for.
Yeah.
But mine, I thought you were going somewhere a little bit different for that. My reason for feeling so hurt by those assumptions is because I was just longing to belong. That I was upset with myself for not wanting to do the riskier thing because I knew it would make them like me, or I thought it would make them like me. But it would have been hurting myself to do so.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting perspective and worth deeper exploration on your path, in the sense that perhaps you already had a stronger sense of who you wanted to be, more than that need to fit in with this particular audience. I don't think that identity of my own self-worth came until much, much later. And on the same notion, the masculinity conundrum could lean into that as well, in the sense that overall people weren't asking me to be a tough go-getter in terms of physicality. Whereas I do know that a lot of those who identify as male have that sense of expectation that if you were a man, you would do this, right? You would be strong, you'd be brave, you'd be risky, you'd be risk takers, which when we have a strong identity of who we are, generally we can shirk it off. And it's one of the reasons why I'm so encouraged by our current youth claiming their identity across the spectrum, not only in gender assignments and orientations, but also in political values. I was much farther along in chronological years before I felt I could choose for myself who I wanted to be. And yet, when that happens younger, the truth of the matter is we don't have a fully developed brain. And so we kind of get sucked into perhaps over exaggerating some of our identity truths before they've actually been brought into perspective, meaning filtered through our heart space before we project them through our voice and our actions. So that's not to say I don't want to undermine anyone in any stage of their identity development, but it does bring us back to that foundation that when we remember our Atman center, we have a firm foundation in which to show up and not need someone else's approval all the time. We still need to connect, don't get me wrong. But if we want to connect first to ourselves, as Brené Brown says, that we have to be connected to ourselves before we can authentically connect to others. Thanks for sharing that. That's helpful perspective to see that other side too.
Thank you.
Thank you.